Hey everyone! Today we're continuing the process of 3D modeling car and vehicle interiors. This is part of a series where I'll be covering interior car modeling from beginning to end. Today's video focuses on how to 3D model seats, which includes modeling the soft leather parts with seams as geometry, creating the stitching with mesh, creating the seat belts with sweep mesh, and much more. This tutorial series is targeted for beginner to advanced skill level in 3D modeling. Maya 2023.2 will be used for this tutorial, but the workflows can be applied to any 3D software as well as any version of Maya. Now before we get into the tutorial, I'd like to thank today's video sponsor, Class Creatives. They offer a top-ranked game design curriculum online. Learn from experts in the field who have experience teaching at accredited universities. All courses are taught by seasoned professionals who have worked at companies like Disney Animation, Naughty Dog, Insomniac Games, Sony, Google, and more. In their masterclass courses, the full character creation workflow is covered from start to finish. The great thing about Class Creatives is the ability to learn at your own pace and your own schedule. Get started today with the link in the description and use your own unique code to receive a special 25% discount off the Pro subscription. So with that, let's get started. Alright, so here we are in Maya, and let's take a look at the finished modeled seats. So I'm going to select the seat group and press Ctrl 1 to isolate, and we can see all of the detail on this model, which includes all of the seam work as geometry, includes stitching as well, and it has the seatbelt hardware, the seatbelts themselves, and some metal pieces that go around the seat inserts. It includes piping as well. So all of this detail is finished, including some simple rails here at the bottom to keep the seat secured. Now, all of this reference or all of this modeling is based off of the reference that I've collected for this Datsun 240Z. So you can see that there's quite a bit going on, and I am modeling this specific seat to go with the theme for this Datsun 240Z Resto Mod by Sung Kang. The fun thing about creating this model is it was created with absolutely no blueprints. So all I had was essentially these main angles and images of this seat. And that's all I had to work with. And that's completely fine because sometimes you're not going to have nice clean blueprints to work with. And you can see it matches pretty close with what the reference looks like. So if I unisolate, I'm actually going to just hide the exterior and interior so we can really focus on this seat here. Now, I do want to emphasize that this tutorial is not a step-by-step tutorial, but instead covers the overall workflows I use to create this finished seat. I did, however, capture the entire modeling process and will include it as a time lapse at the end of the video. So what I'd like to do is show you the progression of how I came to this final seat model. As you can imagine, this is what I started with. It was just this blockout seat that I used just to get the overall size and proportions of the seat, which includes the seat back, the bottom, and the headrest. Then what I did was created these seat curves. Now these were done freehand, but what I ended up doing is, for example, you can select some 3D geometry if you want to start with that. You can make the surface live, and then you can go to Create and then find your curve tools. And I typically use just the CV curve tool. Then from here, I can start to click on this surface and the curves will start to project on this 3D model, as you can see here. So I can just continue to create that down the model, and paying close attention, of course, to our reference, right? And so we have these nice angles here. So I'm making sure to at least kind of match it from these key angles that we'll be viewing the seat from. So I can continue to create that part of the seat, and I hit Q to exit the tool, and I can hit G to repeat last, and I can create kind of this other curve that runs down the side. So this is what's called the bolster of the seat, right? So I'm just doing this at a quick high level so you can get the idea of the workflow. And then I can kind of hide the seat back. And now that we have these curves to work with, I can start to create and modify the geometry to match a lot closer to what it looks like in the reference. So you can see that it actually goes, and it's this continuous seam line here, or this continuous bolster line that goes from the top to the bottom of the seat. Now, one thing you'll see me do in the time lapse a lot is I add curves, or I add control points to my curves. And the way to do that is if you hold right click, go to curve point, select anywhere along the curve like this. So you can see that I've selected this. I then hold shift right click and insert knot. And there you go. So this allows you to just quickly add in a bunch of control points that allows you to just add in more detail without having to rebuild the curve, because sometimes you only need it in a couple of areas, right? So we're just, building up from here. And this workflow is probably one of my favorite workflows, especially if you don't have great reference. If you don't have great reference and you don't have blueprints, well, using this curve workflow as to essentially create your own 3D blueprint of the model is the best way to go, right? I actually covered this in detail on how to 3D model anything. And in the video, I go through exactly the same process that I'm going through here, which is, starting with curves. You can see that I have everything here bookmarked. So if I show more and, I take a look at doing curve guides, you can see I have curve guides here. So it starts with reference, curve guides, and then blockout. So feel free to take a look at this video where I go into much more detail on the overall modeling workflow. So with that, you can see how I created these curves, and I just create one side of these curves, and then from there, I just, mirror them over so I don't have to do it on both sides, right? All right, so once I have that, I start then to create this now going from the curve blockout to this 3D blockout. And the way that I do this is I'll just start with a simple plane. So I create a plane, and I'll just move it over here for this example, and I'll just scale this up, and I will go to subdivision height, and I'll just set these to 1. And then from here, I'll just hold and middle mouse, so I can just middle mouse kind of move it wherever I want, and just kind of roughly put it in position. So I'm just creating essentially the first surface, 3D surface here with this 2D plane. So I'm just going to kind of move it close. And again, I covered this in the how to model 3D video, and I covered this in a lot of my other videos. So I just select the vertice, press C, you can see it highlighting the curve snaps, and middle mouse snap it to this curve. See that? So I'm holding C, then I middle mouse drag, and then it should snap. So if I move it away and then hold middle mouse, it'll snap to the curve. So sometimes it gets a little bit finicky, so just kind of move it away, go to the curve, and it should snap right to it, right? So C, middle mouse, and then while you're holding it, it's nice because, so if I move it away, it'll snap to anywhere on this curve, which is fantastic, right? Because if we're spending the time here on our curves and really making sure, right? So you can see these seat curves. So I spent a bit of time here making sure that this form looks good. So essentially kind of this outline or wireframe of our model based off of our reference. So don't rush this process. This process is going to set you up for a successful model, right? So if everything's looking good here, including like you can see how instead of going straight down here, right? I ended up making it a little bit thicker here on the lower lumbar of the seat. So you can see that in some shots here that it's not straight down, it just goes a little bit wider to help secure the driver in the seat, right? And then I just keep this nice simple middle curve here for symmetry, and I did the same thing for the headrest, right? So again, you're just continuing this process. So now what I can do is select this edge, hold shift, and just simply move it, right? And you can continue. You don't need to snap every vert. I mean, you can just use it as reference, but I would say at least start with doing this. So if I go into X-ray mode, hold X-ray mode, press C, middle mouse, and just kind of snap it to that vertice. I'm just really focusing on this 3D blockout, right? And that's what I did here, and that's what I did for this time lapse. Now, there's a couple different ways you can go about this where you can create like a rough and dirty blockout, which is what I did. Refine the blockout, and then so you can see that I have this rough blockout. I then refined it a bit, and then from here, I just added in some rough bevels to kind of help secure the form like this. I then took this refined blockout and then I retopologized it. I retopoed it. Now, you may be thinking, well, why did you do that? You didn't really have to. And that's true. I didn't really have to, but I just like retopo, right? And it allows me to separate form from topology. And it allows me to, you know what? I don't care. Triangles here, triangles there, kite quads, stretched out quads. I'm just making sure that this model looks good when smooth preview or when it's smooth. Then I can duplicate the model, move it over like so, and I'll hit Control 1 to isolate, and I will mesh smooth this. So I'll hold Shift right click, smooth, and now I have this smooth surface. Now, one key thing actually what I do is, actually if I duplicate again so you can kind of see what happens, and I'll select one of these. If I smooth this, you'll see the model lose just a little bit of volume here, right? So what I tend to do is I'll select the whole model, and I can use either Control middle mouse button and just move things on the normal, or if you want to be very specific, you can go to transform component and just it'll do the same thing. And I give this like a really small value where I'll bump this up like 0.2, 0.25 and make sure that it retains that original volume. And then from there I can smooth, and then I can even from this point, like you can even subdivide this, a couple of divisions if you want. And you can even use your sculpting tools if you wanted to smooth out a couple of areas in this state, right? So this is very similar to just the sculpting workflow in ZBrush or in Mudbox or Blender, is that once you have this and you focus on this form, I can then go to my modeling toolkit, make this surface live, and then go to Quad Draw. Now, definitely take a look at my YouTube channel. I cover Quad Draw so much, and this is a key modeling workflow that I use in anything and everything that I'm modeling. And if you haven't seen this before, I'll just very quickly cover it, is you want to create these points here simply with left click. So if I left click, you're essentially creating vertices and points, right? So these are vertices. So you want to create 4 vertices, then hold shift. You can see now, if I go inside this quad, if I'm outside, I can't really do that. And if I go outside, boom, or inside the face, and while holding shift, right? So inside, holding shift, left click, there you go. You can also do things like tab and left click, and that'll allow you to just copy faces or copy edges to create new faces. You can also hold tab and middle mouse, and it'll create an entire edge loop here to create new faces. Now the key thing here is that you want to make sure to study the model and understand where you need these edge flows. Don't just start creating quads randomly all over the surface of this geometry. We really want to focus on adding edge loops right where we see all of these edge seams and these flows here for these surfaces. So I have this one that goes along essentially the outer point or outer surface of this bolster, and then I have all of these. Now, I didn't worry about all of this detail. That will come later, right? I'm not worried about adding in all of these here, so I add that after I create this retopologized form. So I would start here really focusing on this part of the flow, and this gives me a nice great retopologized model focusing on this edge flow, right? And if you've subdivided the mesh, I'll typically go, 1 or 2, sometimes 3 to 4 edges just to help keep that nice form. And this, again, it doesn't take a long time, especially if you're focusing on good, clean topology, good, clean edge flow. Then, in my time lapse, I retopologize this model probably within 30 minutes. And I'd say it's well worth that effort just to have clean edge flow and clean topology, right? So continuing that process, and then you can also hold control middle mouse, and that'll add in the geometry here and conform to the surface. Now, if you're like, oh man, that's a lot of different shortcuts, don't worry. In the modeling toolkit, while you have the quad draw tool active, go down to keyboard and shortcuts, and boom, you'll see all these shortcuts that I'm talking about with left mouse button, middle mouse button, so on and so forth. So I use this to retopo, and I use this all the time, and that's how I end up with this version of the model where it allows me to have this clean edge flow here for my surface, right? So I can grab my soft parts here, and we can take a look at the key edge flows and edges that I used for this. Now, I made sure I had a nice clean edge that ran from the top and to the seat bottom, and from the seat bottom to the end of the seat here. Right? And I made sure that I had these. Now, I didn't add in these ridges here. I didn't do that until I separated what's called the seat insert from the seat bolsters. All right. So I have the bolsters, I have the seat inserts, and then I have the seat back. And having this seat back allows me to, you'll see in the previous one, it was pretty messy when I had a lot of triangles and whatnot here on the model. And then I retopologized it so it looked a lot better. Now, this model was the full retopologized version. So again, you can see that I have, this nice edge here for the seam on the kind of the seat corner here at the bottom. And then I have these nice edges that go around to the seat bottom here. And you can see I have that separated. And then I have the inserts separated from the geometry here. Now, from this point, I'm ready to go through the process of creating the separate panels, right? So this is like how I handled the car modeling. And what I would do is select all of the key edge loops that I need, like so. And I would double click and select it and make sure that I didn't go too far. You can see where I stopped the edges here, and I can just remove that. Now, since I'm not at the origin, what I can do for the sake of simplicity is set my symmetry to topology, and then I can set it to this center line here for my line of symmetry. And then there we go. We get this nice line of symmetry here, even though we're not at the world origin. Once I have these edges selected, and again, this is after studying our model. So we can see we have obviously the insert, we have the corner of the bottom of the seat, we have, ones that go along the headrest, and in some views, I had to get pretty creative, but, I found some nice high resolution images of the seams that run along the back of the model. So that's kind of that high back model. So I would then select these edges here, and these would be the edges that I'd want to bevel, right? Now, if you want nice, clean bevels, you would do kind of this initial bevel workflow. So this process is how I create the seams, right? So for creating seams, there's various types of seams, and you'll see that there's various types of seams on this seat here. You can see that we have a double top stitch, which is also known as a French seam. We have a single top stitch here. This could also be kind of interpreted as some piping. We have just simple join seams or plain seams here. And you see that all over the model, right? And I have some other examples of the same types, right? You can see that this is what I meant by plain seam. Plain seam is just two leather pieces being joined with no top stitching. Then you have double top stitching here, and then you have single top stitching, right? And you can see here that in this example, we have the double top stitch going into a single top stitch, and you can see that it's getting compressed here where they join, and that's a natural thing that's going to happen when you start to join all these leather pieces together. And you'll see this in various types of materials, fabrics, leathers, so on and so forth. So once we have that, I'm going to kind of show the initial setup, and then I'll show you on another piece of geometry. But I will select the edges, bevel them. I will turn offset as fraction off, because I don't want this to be fraction. Fractional is kind of like proportional to the model. If you turn that off, it allows you to manually set the offset to a very specific value, being 0.5. So I want 0.5 offset, which is, 0.5 or half a centimeter, and then I'll add 2 segments. Okay, now you can see that I already did this on this model. And if you do this where you kind of have this holding edge here, you can always remove that if you don't need it, or they get pretty close sometimes, right? So it's going to get a little messy, but for now, I'm just going to just quickly just remove these edges that I don't need, right? And I can just multi-cut this one, continue that one on. So now I have these edges at 0.5 offset, right, as fraction, which is great. Now from here, this is where I can start separating the model, right? Because I know that in my reference, right, you can kind of see what we have here. Now this is kind of this, some of them get a little bit weird. You get this join seam or this plain seam here, which has some stitching in it, and then this kind of pipe or this this top seam here, and then this goes into it. Now, if I wanted to create that, what I would do is take this edge here, and you can see these edges, the 0.5 as fraction. I want you to understand that these are our supporting edges, right? These are going to help us maintain the form, because I'm going to then bevel this again on that inner edge again, and I'm going to go to offset as fraction off, and I'm going to set segments to 2. But this time I'm going to use 0.35, or not 0.35, 0.3 should be good enough, right? This gives me now the seam that I want to use for this model, okay? Or this part. Now I did go too far, I'd say. I didn't mean to select that one, so I'll deselect this one that runs all the way down here. Oh, it looks like I removed symmetry, but no big deal. So I'll just deselect these edges, and I will turn on topology symmetry there. Okay, and I'm going to actually just delete that edge there so it doesn't do that again. So I have this edge here safely, and what I would do from here is again bevel. So I bevel, and I set offset as fraction off in the settings in the channel box. So remember, if you want to get to the channel box, just hit Control A, or you can hit this icon over here in the top right. So I set offset as fraction to 3 and set segments to 1, and there we go. Once I have that, I can now separate this geometry, and you can see that I can do that with these pieces here. So I'm gonna select this bottom edge and detach it, and for now I'll just detach it, and you'll see again it in the time lapse, and I'll show this on some other pieces so you can really understand this specific workflow. But I'm going to now hold shift right click and detach. So once I detach, that allows me now, or detach those edges, it allows me to select these faces here separately. So I can select these inserts here, and you can just do an extract faces, delete history, and then I have now this part of the seat, right? And this part of the seat where we get that nice, that thick seam here, right? To create the seam, as an example, it's not going to be exactly how I did it, but I want to show you this as an example. What I then do is create what's called the stitch trench. So I go to this and bevel this again with offset as fraction off, and I use a very small value like 0.05 with 2 segments, or not 2 fraction, I meant the 2 segments here. And then what I can do is also add in this middle edge here. Now, these two edges now, right, are going to help support the geometry, right? And give me that detail here to really create that nice seam work. You can see these really nice highlights. So you want to make sure these look nice and round. So what I can do now is select those edges and use transform component. And I won't worry about symmetry. I can just do this on one side and mirror. And I can move this up like so, right? So I can move that up like so. And I typically would move it a small value. So you can use something like 0.1, 0.05, something along those lines. This is very subtle. And then from here, I can click these edges here. Just select these edges that run on the inside. And then now I can extrude these edges inward, right? So now I would select the edges, extrude, and I typically use a value of, probably 0.3. So it's it kind of really goes in pretty deep here. And then I give this a division. So you can add the division through the extrusion or control or use shift right click. So if I do that again, shift right click multi-cut, and then you can just control middle mouse, or in the extrude settings, you can go here and do division set to 2. Then what I can do now is, you can take this and copy this over. So I will go to two faces here. So if you hold control right click, you can convert your selection. So I have edge selected. I hold control right click, two faces, and I think, let me do that with this middle edge here. Control right click, two faces, boom. So I have this face selected, then I'll duplicate this face, right? With that face duplicated, I can then select the geometry again. Now, I goofed and I meant to move this in the opposite direction because this is a stitched trench. So I'm just middle mouse dragging, pushing that inward so you get something like that, all right? So now that I have that, I can find that geometry that I created, and here it is. Now, you'll see that the faces are black because they're facing the other way. The normals are reversed, right? And so what you need to do before you merge that to now the other piece of geometry is simply hold spacebar, and I go to mesh display and then reverse. And there you go. Now I can select these two pieces of geometry, shift right click, combine. Right? And then I can select all the vertices and merge these now at a really, really low threshold. I use 0.003. And then now I can find this group here that I was working with. If I hit 3 to smooth preview, there you go. Right? So this is an example of how I applied this seam to this object, right? So, and you can use this workflow to apply any different seams to any different part of the model. So it's going to be a lot of that where you take the edge, extrude it in, duplicate it, extract it when you duplicate the mesh, and then recombine it to the other piece. So what you get is this nice, super watertight mesh here with these faces right on top of each other. And that's exactly how stitching and seam work works. And this is the workflow that I've used, and I've been in the auto industry since 2010. We use this for everything, by the way. This is automotive leather. This is anything fabric. I've done this for purses, handbags, shoes, anything, right? And it works really well and gives you this good sense of realism and detail. So again, you can see we're mimicking how things are in real life. If we, of course, wanted to take this and optimize it, we can then create a low poly version, but we can always talk about that later. All right. So that's kind of the workflow being applied to the seat geometry. And for this seat, let me grab the last one here, is that I then extracted it here. And once I extracted the seat, actually let me hide the whip folder. I think that's what's confusing me. There we go. Is that once you have that, I extracted the seat insert first. So you'll see kind of the order that I did this in. So I created this seam first, this pipe seam here, or that initial seam. I then, so what I did was separate the seat insert, then create this seam here. Then once I did that, I separated it, and then I created the join plane seams here. So you get something like this. And it works really, really well. And you can see that the geometry is going in underneath, and it works fantastic, right? So if we take a look at applying, this is how I applied the workflow to the seat itself. If I now go to seam examples, you'll kind of see this, I like to separate the workflows so you can see exactly how things are being done. So we'll come back to the seatbelt piece later, but here we go. And we got this stitch group here. I'll hide that. So here I have this nice simple piece of geometry, and you can see how I created the plain seam, how I created the double stitch, and how I created the single top stitch, right? So if I start here, I'll duplicate this. And if I want to create this nice simple plain seam with no stitching, what I would do is I would just walk through the process again. So I would select these edges, shift right click, bevel. I want to create the supporting edges first. And I use an offset of fraction off, set this to 0.5, use 2 segments. And then I can select this inner edge here. And from this, like if I grab the example of the plain seam, you'll see that there's no stitch trench. There's just a nice simple edge here in the middle. So I'm doing that here as well. And now I can bevel again, and I'll use that bevel value of offset as fraction off, and I'll use 0.3 and then 2 segments. Now I'll put up these settings that I used specifically in the YouTube video, or I'll put it in the description or the comments. Keep in mind, when you use offset as fraction, it is expecting you to be to scale. So these are to scale values. So if you're modeling at the grid, like really small at the grid, and your whole seat is here, these bevels will be huge. So please keep that in mind, that scale is important. You should always be modeling to scale. So with this edge selected, I can detach, and then from here, I will extract the face. And then I will grab this now edge here, and I can hit Control E for extrude, and boom, you can see that it extrudes, and I use a value of 0.3, so minus 0.3 with 2 divisions, and there you go. Now this is where I'll select this middle edge here, hold Control right click, go to two faces, and then I will go to duplicate face, go to object mode, deselect the side that I don't need, select the side that I do need, and then before we get too excited, we have to reverse the normal. So I'll hold space bar, mesh display, reverse, or you can find it up here at mesh display, reverse. Then I can select these faces, combine these now, shift right click, combine, and there we go. I can move this back to this, oh, there it was. This is duplicate model. So there we are. Then what I have is this. And if I hit smooth preview, there you go, right? And I need to make sure, right? By the way, you can see that I have this border edge highlighted on. I always recommend having that on because it makes it really easy to see why things aren't merging. I'm like, oh, okay, if the border's highlighted, then that lets me know that there's unwelded verts. If you want to enable that, go to Windows, Setting Preferences, and then under Display, then Polygons, right here, you want to make sure to do Highlight Border Edges. Honestly, that should be on by default. Always have that on. You can always set it to 2 or 3. Then once you do that, restart Maya and you'll be good to go. Because what that lets me know is I select all my vertices, shift right click, merge vertices, use a really low threshold, and boom, there we go. Now we have this, which is really nice, and we have these edges here that we can work with. So if I select both objects, go to modeling toolkit, I can go into edge mode, and I can just modify these at the same time. And I can control middle mouse button, move these, and then there you go. So it gives me these nice controlling edges here for these seams, which is great, which works really nice for the plane seam, right? Now, if I wanted to do this again, the workflow is very similar, but I'm gonna do this again for a double top stitch, right? So for double top stitch, it's the same thing. So, I'll be going a little bit faster now. So I'll select this edge, we'll bevel it, we'll turn offset as fraction off. And again, we'll do the 0.5 fraction with 2 segments. There we go. Select the edge again, bevel this. And from here, I can turn offset as fraction off, use an offset of 3 with 2 segments. Okay, then I can select this edge that runs down the middle, detach component, and then you can either select the face and extract, or you can run a mesh separate. Sometimes works nice if you're doing this, and it'll just separate all separate faces. So just be careful before you do that. You don't have like a ton of objects doing that with separate. But yeah, you can select the faces and extract, select the edge. I can use Control E for extrude again, and just move these in on the normal, the local translate. And again, I use 0.3 with 2 divisions. Oops, I did not mean to disable keep faces together, with 2 divisions. And then I can select these faces here. And you can, of course, I should have did it when they were both combined, but what I can do is, actually, let's just finish the extrusion. I don't want to keep jumping back and forth. So I select the edge here, Control, right click, 2 faces, duplicate the face, and then I can go back here where I select these faces here, reverse the normals. Oops, didn't want to do that. So I'll reverse, select these, shift right click, combine, and weld the vertices so you can see that it's bold here for border edges, and watch when I merge, boom, they're back to normal. And I have that here with the base plane, boom. So I got these, and what I can do now is create that stitch trench, right? And the way that I want to do that is select these edges here and bevel them, and I'll use a very small one like 0.05 or like 0.1. It just depends on how tight that's going to be. So that should work. Oops. I, of course, need to make sure that I turn offset as fraction off and then use a really small value. There we go, like 0.025. So it's off a little bit there. And then 2 segments. And then we're doing the same thing here in bevel. And I can go to my settings, offset as fraction off, offset with 0.025, 2 segments, and there you go. So we have our what's called our stitch trench. And I can now select these edges, and we can use transform component, or you can kind of freehand it if you want to move it in on the normal. I'll show you transform component on these ones next. So now what I can do is add in kind of this middle mouse, grab my multi-cut, hold control. So if I grab multi-cut, hold control, and then middle mouse click, it will put it right in the center, which is exactly where I want it. And I can grab these faces, or excuse me, these edges, and middle mouse move them up a little if I wanted to, or I can be precise, use transform component, but it gets a little annoying because it does it one at a time. But you can see that I can put this here. It should be based off of local translate. So I can do like a, 0.1, no, that's too much, like a 0.05. And you can play with these values. I don't like using like, oh, this is exactly what you should use, because, sometimes it just varies. You have different types of seams and whatnot. So you have this, and I hit smooth preview, and boom. And then now this nice supporting edge that we have allows us to control the highlight of our edges, and there you go. So now you can see that I can select these edges on the outside for this double top stitch, and get a little bit more highlights there. And I'm using this nice Fong material so I can see a bit more. And then that works well. All right, so that's your double top stitch. And I'll put these back in here. And the last one is the most complicated, but it looks the nicest. If I grab my single top stitch, so I'm going to grab my base plane again, and we'll just walk through this again. I will bevel this edge with smooth preview off, of course, off, and then I will set offset to 0.5, so we have our supporting edges with 2 segments. And then I will again bevel this here, and I will add in, off with 2 segments again. So we have that. And then now this time, before I do that, well, I guess what I should say is before, if this was a double top stitch, I'd bevel and create the stitch trench now. But since this is a single, I can create the bevel and create a stitch trench now. So I can create that offset here and use, a nice tight 0.025 with 2 segments, and there we go. Now what I want to do, so I have everything almost in place here, is I want to select this middle edge, and I want to now detach components and extract the faces. Okay, and we're going to work just on this single seam side. So what I'm going to do is isolate that with Control 1, and I'm going to select these edges here. So I select that, and I'll hit Control E again for extrude, and I'm going to extrude, but instead of 0.3, I'm going to go a little bit less, and I'm going to go minus 0.15, because what I'm creating here is this, sometimes they'll be thicker, but I'm creating this type of seam where it kind of goes and folds in underneath with only a single seam. So I will also add 2 divisions, and then what I will do is grab these edges here, select these, and do it again. I will extrude again, and I'll do the same thing, minus 0.15. And look where I'm extruding it. I'm not extruding it down, I'm extruding it inward, right? And this is going to give me that nice loop in around, and this will give me this nice offset, or I should put in 2 divisions, and there we go. And then what I can do is grab this edge that goes on the side and just move this or transform component this out a little bit. That works good. And then I can add in that top one here, and that'll allow me to control the top part of the seam. And there you go. So you get now this nice geometry here, right? If you look at this section, and this is going to give you that nice loop. And of course I can select the stitch trench and move it down a bit. So we have that. So what I can do now is select these faces, go to 2 faces, but I want to, actually, it'll make more sense if I bring the other geometry back. I want to duplicate them right up until they meet, which is right about here, that if you can see that. So I will select the faces, and I'll hit shift period. And then shift period is going to let you, it's those caret brackets, or angle brackets. So I can shift period again. It's growing my selection. So just make sure you have clean selections. Otherwise, you have to be a bit more precise. Then I can duplicate the face, delete the history. I'm going to deselect the side I don't need, select the side I do need, and then we get this. So it looks a little bit weird, but if I reverse the faces and just go through the same steps where I shift, right click, combine, and merge vertices, boom, there you go. Now what I want to do is go back to my main group here, delete history, and watch what happens is you'll see it kind of curves in, but what we want to do is simply delete it, and it's like magic. You delete this edge right here with Control backspace, so watch, boom. Now it's this edge, these faces that go in underneath, and you get such a nice tight seam, and it looks so good. And then what you can do now is move this edge out a little bit, move it up on the normal if you want, and then you do the same thing with this side, I can control shift middle mouse, move it, then control middle mouse, move on the normal, and there it is. You have a nice, beautiful top stitch with this nice geometry. And this is what I use for anything that requires seams. All right. So I hope this walkthrough was helpful. So now what I'm going to do is just quickly cover how I did the rest of the seat. So I'm going to hide these samples. And once you go through the process of now having the seams complete, you want to create the stitches. So the process for creating stitches, what I normally do at work is we typically have a proprietary tool or some plugins that we use, but I want to make sure to show you a workflow that you can use that works, that's free and native to Maya. And in order to do that, I used Mesh. All right. So the first thing you need is your stitch. So if I have this stitch group and I zoom in on it, it's this really, really small stitch. And here's the key thing, you guys. You got to make sure at this point that your stitch has UVs. So I have this nice stitch UV. If you have a texture, you can use that or base your UVs off of that. And this is a shadow plane. This is completely optional and definitely adds to the poly count. So don't use this if you need optimization. I mean, if you need optimization, texture stitching, don't do it this way. This is for very, very high-end CG. But if you want to learn how to add stitching, this will be the workflow that you can use native to Maya. So we have this, and I have these both in a group, and I have these both with separate materials. That's another key thing. So you'll see that I have just this with matte shadow, and then this with matte stitch. And then they're both in this stitch group, and the pivot here, if I turn on my grid, is based off of the 0, 0, 0, and I'll use this for my stitching. Now, in order to create the stitching, we need to create the stitch curves, all right? So the way that you want to do this is I'll take the seat inserts, for example. I'll hit Control D for duplicate and Shift P to unparent. Now, I'll hit 1 to unsmooth preview. And then I will shift right click mesh smooth. Okay. So you want to make sure that your curves are based off of whatever divisions that your final model will be. So if you know you're going to be doing high-end renders at tube subdivisions, make sure to have your divisions set to 2. So that will work fine. And with this now, we can look at our model, and what I want to do is select my edges now and convert these to a curve selection. So the way that I want to do that is go to Modify, Convert, and then you go to Polygon Edges to Curves. Hit the dialog box because we don't want to use the default settings. You can see that what we have here. Now, I'd recommend using linear and disable conform mesh to smooth preview, and then hit apply. And there you go. So with that, you can continue the process, right? You can actually keep this up. I'll keep this up. Here, the polygon edges to curves, so you can see the settings again, but you can just simply hit G for repeat last. I have scripts that I typically use that allows you to automate this process, so you can just select all the edges at once and it'll go through and create the curves and stitches. But again, I'll just use kind of the native tools here. All right, so you get all the curves. I'm not going to go through and do them. I already have them created, right? And I will just hide these for now and hide this geometry for now. And for seam, or not here, if I unisolate and we can look at stitch curves, here are all the curves that have stitches. So what I'd recommend is you'll notice in my seat group here in my stitches, I actually have them as mesh objects, and I had to do them separately for a few of the parts because if they're at too different an orientation, then Maya or Mesh has a hard time trying to get all of them to align properly. So I just did all the inserts as one, and then I did these ones separately because it kept flipping them, even though I had transforms frozen. So again, I just ended up doing it a few times, which wasn't a big deal, and they're high quality and work really well. So I'll start with the example. So I'll hide these stitches. So I'll start with the example for these stitch curves right here. Now that the curves are created, we can go on to creating the stitching. Now, I'm re-recording this because I found a slightly better way to do this that's less complicated while still using Mesh. So what we want to do is head over to our stitch group, and you can see I actually removed the shadow plane because it wasn't giving me the results that I wanted, and with some better tools it actually conforms to the geometry better. So for right now we're just going to stick with this simple stitch, and with this stitch here I'll head over to effects and then mesh and create mesh network. So you can see it creates the mesh network there. Now we want to add the curve groups to the mesh network. So let me unpin this and head down to the outliner, go to mesh, and you want to go to curve. And if you click the curve node, just now add curve node. And so we can add curve node to the mesh network, and we can add all of our curves here. Now, like I said previously, I don't want to put all of the curves here. Instead, I want to just kind of use the inserts first, and then I'll do the side bolsters and then the headrests later. So this should work. And there we go. So I have all of that selected and I don't have the headrests. So what I need to do is go to mesh, and then I can pin the tab here. If you don't have the pin tab in a newer version of Maya, you can just simply use copy tab and it'll duplicate the tab so you can add the curves to it. So once I've pinned this, I can now select my curves and middle mouse drag them into the input curves, and there you go. You see all of the curves have been added to the mesh network. And I'm going to hide the seat so we can really just see what we have here. Now you can start to see what we have. If you have this new node created, this mesh 5 reproduction mesh or repro mesh. So what we want to do is just start to modify these settings. Now you want to go to mesh distribute first, and we want to increase this quite a bit. I'm going to bump this up to at least 1,000, and it's not doing what we want yet. So we will set the distance to 0. So we have X, Y, Z, all of these offsets and everything set to 0. So that would work fine. And then from here, we can head over to our curve tab. And this is actually what I'm simplifying from previous. There's a step setting. We actually don't want to use this. Instead, you can just ignore step, and you can see that there we go. It goes ahead and applies the 1,000 or so stitches along the curve. Now you can see it's a little bit short, and if it's a little bit short, you can use this clip start here to kind of change where it starts and ends a little bit. So you can just kind of drag that over, and you can see there it goes very nicely. And this works really, really well. This works a lot better than actually what I did in the time-lapse and the recording, because previously I was using step and trying to really make sure that I got the distribute working well with this. Now, you'll actually, if we get in close, you can see that they're rotated. They have the wrong orientation. So simply go to your stitch group and head to your channel box, and I believe it's just rotating this 90 degrees in the X. There we go. So if I rotate this 90 degrees in the X, that gives me what I want. And these gaps are pretty big for your standard stitch. So what I want to do instead is I want to head back to mesh. If I hit Control A, go to my mesh network, unpin this. And I want to just add a little bit more points here. So I'll start to, increase that, and 1,500 points works pretty good. It starts to overlap a little bit, so I can be more precise by dragging the slider here, so it kind of cleans that up a little bit, or I can bring that in. I might have to clean up some of the stitches, but overall, this gives me a really, really good result, and, I'm really happy with how this turned out. Now, this is what I was talking about. Some of the curves sometimes just have the opposite orientation. If that's the case, then I will just recreate the mesh network specifically for this curve. So no big deal. But great, once you have this and you're happy with the results, you can simply just duplicate this mesh reproduction and you can delete the mesh once you're done with it. And if I hit delete, and I can select this as geometry, and here we go. We have the mesh stitches with the material and no history for mesh. It's just the geometry. And that's really the quickest way that I like to just create geometry instead of having that live connection to mesh. I know that there's utilities and you can always bake them, but for what we're doing here, simply duplicating with no history will work. All right, so that's how you create stitches with mesh. Now, onto the last section, which is the seatbelts. You can see that I have these seatbelts here, and let me find the curves real quick. Okay, there we go. So I got my curves. Sometimes it's a little bit hard to see what's going on, so you can always use show disable polygon view, and then you'll be able to see like I knew that the seatbelts were just curves, so that was just a quick easy way. And I'll hide my whip folder since I don't need that. But now that I have this, you can see that these are the curves that I used for the seatbelts. And again, I did it the exact same way, is that I made this surface live and I went to create and curve tools, CV curve tools, and I just started to create the curves for the seatbelts on top of this once I made this live. So, and you know, during curvature area, I do make sure to follow the edge flow just so the seatbelt conforms nicely. And then once I have enough points, I can move that. Now, these seatbelts specifically, they attach to the roll cage. So that's why they kind of go off. They're not just randomly stopping behind the seat. So you can see in this reference that they come out behind and wrap and secure to the roll cage. So that seatbelt harness is pretty secure. So I have that, and that's how I created the curves, just like I did previously when I did, the just curve work. Then I'll hide the hardware for now, just so we can focus on the curves. And what I can do is just kind of move these out a little bit. And, you can make adjustments because when you make live, you have to make sure that it conforms properly to the geometry. So, I can do whatever else that I need to do, make adjustments to this curve here. So I'll just use this as a quick example for the seatbelt that kind of comes all the way down. Now, what I used to do is I used to create geometry, and that would be the profile, and then I would extrude, but you no longer have to do that. At least starting in Maya 2022, you can use a sweep mesh, which is really, really nice. So it's right here on the poly modeling, or you go to create sweep mesh. So it's right there. So you just select the curve that you want, and you hit sweep mesh, and there you go. Like you can see that it's starting with this polygon tool. This polygon tool that basically means you can change it to however many sides you want, including a cube. But I want to use rectangle, and I want to start with rectangle, and I ended up using a width of about, I think it was about 6, and then a height, since it's pretty thin, I ended up using maybe 0.5 or 0.4, and the corner radius I reduced down to 0.1. So very, very nice, very, very easy, and of course, being Maya, you have the history, right? So it's like you create that geometry and you can just kind of move and position this how you see fit, and the history will attach accordingly to that. So very, very nice way, very easy way to do that. For those that don't have Maya, this is just the way that I used to do it, where I'll start with the face here. So if I take this, so I grab one of these curves, I'll duplicate it with no history, use the cube, and I'll just kind of again, use middle mouse and just kind of put it in position. So I have it kind of starting there. And I would set it to be, whatever the thickness is that I had. So from here, I would just grab the face and I'd shift left click the curve, and then you can do an extrude. And then of course it goes straight to the bottom, which we don't want. We want to increase the divisions. So there you go. It works very similarly, but now I have to do some beveling of the corners and whatnot. But like I said, this is a tutorial for anybody like that's using different versions of Maya. That's the workflow that I would use. And for the record, Mesh has been in Maya at least since 2006. So, excuse me, 2016. All right. So we got that. Boom, boom. So now that's how I did the seat belts, the belts themselves, and the hardware is pretty straightforward. I mean, this one was just you'll see this in the time lapse. This is obviously just a half split torus that I used, and then I just made sure that it intersects. What I may have to do later is maybe cap this and give this a material or cut in holes. I really don't want to cut in holes in the geometry, so I may just put like a circular geometry. What I mean is like I might just take this and extrude and then collapse the center so you get that, and I can use that, you know, to create any different fabrics, right? Because again, if I'm looking at the reference here, it's based off of this, so you can kind of see it goes in a little bit, but it doesn't go in too deep. So I can use that to at least kind of fake it a bit. And for the seatbelt, these were pretty simple, as simple as they get. Is I have just this beveled cube here, and I just cap this off, and that's covered in the time lapse. For the sake of time, I won't really cover exactly doing this one-to-one, but the seatbelt actually kind of latches in. And this part of the seatbelt, I actually looped it around. I need to clean this this edge here up a little bit, but for now, this works how I need it. Now, this piece was interesting. This is kind of the belt buckle harness, and that's kind of based off of this. And there's actually another piece of fabric that I have to create for that. Now, for that piece, for this metal piece anyways, what I did was if I go to my demo group and head over to seatbelt, you'll see this here. And as usual, for this piece, I just used a combination of booleans. So I took this simple piece of geometry that was the overall shape, and you might be wondering, how did I figure out the size? I just went a little bit thicker than the seatbelt. And I used this relative to the distance between the two. So that got me pretty close. I don't have dimensions. I'm just doing everything by eye and scale of reference. And we're getting pretty close here. So this should be fine. But yeah, I have these pieces and I just Boolean these out. And once I Boolean them, I then cleaned up the geometry where I had something like this, and then I ended up just, having enough geometry to support this, and then I duplicated and mirrored the piece over. So that's it at a high level. I'm not trying to rush or anything, but I think we're at quite a bit of time here. This is a long one today, but I covered a lot of different topics, and all of these are like key workflows that I use all the time, you guys. So I hope you found this tutorial helpful. This has been so far a really fun process. We're making really good progress and doing a lot of process workflows here. And the next thing that I'm going to cover is modeling now that I have the steering wheel. The seat is doing my best to just knock out the instrument panel and the console. And the door is really simple. Like if we look at the reference, the door is really simple. It's about as simple as it gets. I've got a little door handle and stuff like that, and a little roll cage. There's other miscellaneous components. There's pedals here. There's this metal floor mat. The handbrake, the shifter boot. There's still a lot to cover, but I'll probably condense it down into a couple of videos. That way we can look at focusing on new topic. As usual, if you found this helpful, let me know down below. Let me know if you have any questions. I know there was a lot covered today, and maybe I can cover things that were a little bit confusing in separate videos. So with that, I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you all around. Take care.